By the time Berlin fell, the name Hitler had become something more than a surname. It was a warning. A symbol of dictatorship, war, genocide, and a regime that had left Europe in ruins. Adolf Hitler was dead. Eva Braun was dead. The Third Reich was collapsing around them. But one question remained hidden behind the ruins. What happened to the people who shared his blood? His sister was still alive. His nephews were scattered across different countries. One had fought for Germany. Another would eventually serve in the American Navy. Some carried the Hitler surname into the post-war world. Others abandoned it. And decades later, a small number of Hitler's relatives would still be alive, living ordinary lives under names most people would never recognize. There was another strange detail. Adolf Hitler himself left no confirmed biological children. So if his direct line ended with him, what exactly survived? The answer is darker, quieter, and more complicated than the legend suggests. Because the Hitler family did not disappear in 1945. They simply became much harder to find. The story begins with the woman who, after the collapse of the Third Reich, suddenly became one of the most uncomfortable people in Europe. Her name was Paula Hitler. She was Adolf's younger full sister, born in 1896, and unlike almost every other member of his immediate family, she survived long enough to see the world turn completely against her brother's name. In July 1945, only months after Adolf's suicide, American military intelligence questioned her. The interrogation document is remarkably revealing because Paula did not speak like the sister of a man whose name had become synonymous with absolute power. She described a childhood in Austria, the death of their mother, and the distance that had existed between herself and Adolf when they were young. She even told investigators that after Adolf left home, there was a long period when she did not know whether he was alive. That detail matters. For years, propaganda had presented Hitler as a man whose entire life revolved around destiny, Germany, and political power. But Paula's testimony exposed another version of him. A brother who had left home, disappeared from her daily life, and eventually returned as a political figure whose power would make the ordinary family relationship almost impossible. And now, in 1945, that brother was dead. The Reich was gone. And Paula was left carrying the surname. The Allies questioned her because of who she was, not because she had been a major political figure herself. Her brother had controlled the state. She had not. And when the investigation was over, Paula was not sent to a concentration camp or executed. She eventually returned to civilian life. But civilian life was never going to be normal again. The woman who had once simply been Adolf Hitler's little sister had become a historical liability. She would later live under the name Paula Wolf, and she never had children. She died in 1960, making her the last surviving member of Adolf Hitler's immediate full-sibling family. But Paula was only one branch of the family tree, and the other branches were far more complicated. Adolf Hitler had two older half-siblings from his father's earlier marriage, Alois Hitler Jr. and Angela Hitler. Both had children, and that meant something extraordinary. Even though Adolf himself had no confirmed children, his family line had not ended. It had simply moved sideways. Angela's family became particularly important because her children had been close to Adolf during his rise. Her daughter, Angela Jelly Raubal, had died in 1931 under circumstances that generated decades of speculation. But her brother Leo Raubal survived the war. And Leo's story would take him directly into one of the most brutal chapters of World War II. Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr. had been born in Austria in 1906. He became an engineer and later served in the German armed forces. During the war he was sent east. Then came Stalingrad. When the German Sixth Army was trapped, Leo was wounded and captured by Soviet forces. Suddenly Hitler's own nephew was behind enemy lines. And this created an extraordinary problem inside the Nazi leadership. According to historical accounts, efforts were made to secure Leo's release, including claims that Hitler considered or authorized an exchange involving Soviet prisoners. The precise details of the proposed exchange have been disputed, so the story should not be treated as an uncontested fact. But one thing is certain. Leo survived Soviet captivity. The nephew who had been trapped in the catastrophe of Stalingrad eventually returned to Austria after the war. And what happened next is almost surreal. The nephew of Adolf Hitler did not become a politician. He did not try to rebuild the family name. He became an engineer and teacher. He lived quietly. He died in 1977. And his son, Peter Raubal, inherited something far stranger than money or political power. He inherited a connection to Adolf Hitler. A connection he had never asked for. Peter had been born in 1931, before the war, before the Holocaust had reached its unimaginable scale, and before his great-uncle became one of the most infamous figures in modern history. By adulthood, Peter was living in Austria and working as an engineer. There was no empire waiting for him. No throne. No political movement. Just a family history that could never be separated from one name: Hitler. But there was another branch of Angela's family. Her daughter Elfriede. Unlike her sister Jelly, whose life ended tragically in 1931, Elfriede survived into the post-war era. She married Ernst Hochiger in 1937 and had children of her own. She lived until 1993. That means one of Adolf Hitler's close family branches remained alive for nearly half a century after his death. And yet, outside historical research, almost nobody knew. That was becoming the pattern. The closer the world looked at the Hitler family after 1945, the less it found of Hitler himself. No political dynasty. No secret Nazi succession. No family empire. Just people trying to live ordinary lives beneath an extraordinary surname. But the most astonishing case was not in Austria. It was in America. Because one of Hitler's nephews had done something that sounds almost impossible. He had turned against his uncle and eventually fought on the side of the country that was preparing to destroy Nazi Germany. His name was William Patrick Hitler. He was the son of Alois Hitler Jr., Adolf's half-brother. William had been born in Liverpool in 1911 and spent part of his early life in Britain. His relationship with his famous uncle was complicated, and during the 1930s he attempted to use the family connection to advance himself. But as Europe moved toward war, that surname became both an opportunity and a trap. William eventually left Britain for the United States. And then the war changed everything. A man carrying the Hitler surname was now living inside the country that had become one of Nazi Germany's greatest enemies. The irony was almost perfect. Adolf Hitler was commanding German forces against the Allies. His nephew was in America. And eventually, William would serve in the United States Navy. The man who had been born into the Hitler family was now wearing the uniform of a country fighting his own uncle's regime. The family connection that had once opened doors had become a burden. After the war, William made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He abandoned the Hitler surname. In 1947, he became William Patrick Stuart-Houston. The change was more than cosmetic. It was an attempt to sever the connection between his private life and the most infamous surname in the world. He married Phyllis Jean-Jacques and settled on Long Island, New York. There, far from Berlin and the ruins of the Third Reich, he built a family. 4 sons were born: Alexander Adolf, Louis, Howard Ronald, and Brian William. The names were no longer Hitler. They were Stuart-Houston. And the family became intensely private. But then something happened that would create one of the strangest legends surrounding the Hitler family. None of William's 4 sons had children. Howard married, but died in a car accident in 1989. The others remained childless. And suddenly, the Hitler bloodline seemed to be approaching another ending. Not because a war had destroyed it. Not because a government had ordered it. But because the surviving relatives had disappeared into ordinary life. There have been repeated claims that the brothers made an explicit pact never to marry or have children in order to end Adolf Hitler's bloodline. The story has been repeated for years. But it requires caution. Journalist David Gardner reported the existence of such an agreement, while Alexander Stuart-Houston disputed the idea that there had been a formal pact. What is confirmed is simpler. William Patrick Hitler's 4 sons had no children of their own. And that distinction matters. Because history has a habit of turning silence into legend. The truth is not necessarily that the family gathered around a table and swore an oath. The truth may be more human. They knew exactly who their great-uncle was. They knew what his name meant. And they chose not to make that name the center of their lives. That decision became even more powerful because William Patrick himself had already taken the opposite path from Adolf. He had served in the American military. He had changed his surname. He had raised children who would grow up without carrying Hitler as their family name. And eventually, William died in 1987. By then, Adolf Hitler had been dead for 42 years. The dictator who had once controlled Germany had become a historical figure. His nephew had become an American citizen living quietly on Long Island. The contrast was almost impossible to ignore. One man had tried to reshape the world. The other spent his final decades trying to escape its attention. But there was still another question. What happened to the Hitler surname itself? Because changing a name does not change ancestry. And that meant that even after the surname disappeared from some branches, the bloodline continued through other relatives. Angela's descendants carried the Raubal and Hochiger names. Alois Jr.'s descendants carried Stuart-Houston. The family tree had become almost invisible. And this is where the story becomes much stranger. For decades, people have searched for a direct descendant of Adolf Hitler. A son, a daughter, someone who could say with biological certainty, "I am his descendant." But there is no historically verified child of Adolf Hitler. He married Eva Braun on April 29, 1945. The following day both were dead. Hitler's death was officially established after the war, and German archival records preserve documentation concerning the deaths of Hitler and Eva Braun. Yet rumors of secret children never disappeared. One of the most famous claims involved a Frenchman named Jean-Marie Loret, who alleged that Hitler had fathered him during World War I. The story has fascinated journalists and conspiracy theorists for decades. But fascination is not proof. The claim remains unverified, and there is no accepted historical evidence establishing Loret as Hitler's biological son. This distinction is crucial. There are descendants of Hitler's family. There are no confirmed direct descendants of Adolf Hitler himself. And that difference changes the entire story. Because the people who inherited Hitler's blood did not inherit his power. They inherited something far more difficult. A name, a family connection, and the knowledge that millions of people would hear their surname and immediately think of mass murder. Imagine growing up and discovering that the man at the center of your family tree was Adolf Hitler. There is no way to make that information ordinary. You could change your name. You could move countries. You could refuse interviews. You could never speak publicly. But you could not change the family tree. And some relatives did exactly that. They withdrew. They avoided publicity. They lived ordinary professional lives. And in doing so they created an unusual paradox. The Hitler family became less visible precisely because the name became more famous. The world remembered Adolf Hitler. But it forgot the people who came after him. By the late 20th century, the surviving relatives were no longer living as members of a political dynasty. They were engineers, teachers, private citizens, and people whose lives had almost nothing to do with the ideology that had made their family name infamous. Leo Raubal died in 1977. William Patrick Hitler died in 1987. Elfriede Hochiger died in 1993. Paula Hitler had already died in 1960. And as the decades passed, the people who had personally known Adolf Hitler disappeared one by one. The memories disappeared with them. That may be the most haunting part of the story. For a short period after 1945, there were people alive who could still remember Adolf Hitler as a brother, an uncle, a relative. Paula could remember him before the Nazi Party. Leo could remember him as an uncle. William could remember the private man behind the public dictator. But eventually those voices went silent. And what remained was the historical monster. The photographs, the speeches, the ruins, the documents, the names of millions of victims. The family itself became almost irrelevant. Except it wasn't gone. It had simply moved into the shadows. And today, claims about the exact number and identity of living Hitler relatives must be handled carefully because many surviving family members are private individuals, and public reporting about them is incomplete or outdated. The best documented descendants include the Stuart-Houston branch in the United States and descendants of Angela Hitler through the Raubal and Hochiger families in Austria and Germany. Some have been reported as childless, but claims that every surviving relative deliberately agreed to end the bloodline should not be presented as established fact. That leaves us with an extraordinary historical irony. Adolf Hitler spent his political life obsessed with bloodlines. He built an ideology around ancestry, race, heredity, and the idea that certain bloodlines were destined to dominate while others were destined to disappear. Yet his own personal bloodline did not become a dynasty. There was no Hitler heir waiting to inherit the Reich. No Hitler son taking command. No Hitler daughter carrying the family into a new generation. Instead, the relatives who survived became ordinary people. Some changed their names. Some disappeared from public life. Some served in armies fighting against Hitler's Germany. Some refused to discuss the family history. And some simply lived long enough for the world to forget them. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who wanted to create a 1,000-year Reich left behind no confirmed child to inherit it. His political empire lasted barely 12 years. His dictatorship ended in a bunker. His buildings were destroyed. His symbols were outlawed. His government collapsed. And the relatives who carried his blood had no interest in rebuilding what he had created. That is the part of the story that is often missed. The Hitler family did not continue Hitler's empire. It survived it. And perhaps the most remarkable survivor was not the person who carried the surname longest, or the relative who received the most attention. It was the person who managed to live without allowing Adolf Hitler to define his entire existence. Because history usually focuses on the powerful, kings, dictators, presidents, generals. But families experience history differently. For a dictator, the end of a regime can mean death. For his relatives, it can mean something stranger. A lifetime of explaining who you are not. Paula was not Adolf. Leo was not Adolf. William was certainly not Adolf. Their descendants were not responsible for his crimes. And yet, their family tree connected them to one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. That burden cannot be inherited morally, but it can be inherited historically. And that may be why the story of Hitler's family after 1945 is so uncomfortable. There is no final dramatic scene where the bloodline is destroyed. No secret execution. No final heir stepping forward. No hidden Nazi prince waiting in exile. Instead, there is silence. A surname changed. A family moving away. A nephew fighting against his uncle's regime. A sister being questioned by American intelligence. Children growing up with a different last name. And eventually, people who could have told the story disappearing into old age. The world wanted Hitler's story to end in 1945. In one sense it did. The man died. The regime collapsed. The war ended. But families do not end as neatly as governments. The blood continued through his relatives. Not through a son. Not through a daughter. Not through a secret heir. Through siblings, nephews, nieces, and their descendants. And that creates one final question. Was the Hitler bloodline actually ended by choice? The evidence does not allow us to say that with absolute certainty. There are strong reports of childlessness among some surviving descendants. There are claims of a family agreement. There are denials of such a formal pact. And because these people are private citizens rather than public historical figures, much of their personal lives remain undocumented. The safest conclusion is also the most fascinating. The family did not need a dramatic oath to disappear from history. It happened naturally. One generation died. Another changed its name. Another refused the spotlight. And another simply had no children. The name Hitler became increasingly detached from the people who actually carried his blood. That is why, more than 80 years after the fall of the Third Reich, the family story feels almost like a historical ghost. The dictator is everywhere. His relatives are almost nowhere. His face is preserved in photographs. Their faces are largely forgotten. His speeches are archived. Their conversations vanished. His decisions are studied in universities around the world. Their lives became private. And perhaps that is the final irony. Adolf Hitler wanted to make himself impossible to forget. He succeeded. But the people who shared his blood spent generations doing the opposite. They tried to become forgettable. They did not inherit his empire. They did not inherit his ideology. They did not inherit his political power. They inherited only the consequences of being related to him. And eventually, even that connection began to fade. History remembers the dictator. It rarely remembers the family members who survived the dictator. But behind the photographs and the ruins there was a family. A sister who lived until 1960. A nephew who survived Stalingrad and Soviet captivity. A nephew who crossed the Atlantic and eventually served in the American Navy. A niece who lived quietly until 1993. Children who carried different surnames. And descendants who, whether by deliberate choice or simply by the course of life, did not turn the Hitler name into a new dynasty. The Reich disappeared. The ideology was defeated. The man died without a confirmed child. But the family story did not end in the bunker. It continued quietly, almost invisibly, through people who had to live with a history they did not create. And perhaps that is the strangest ending of all. The most infamous name of the 20th century did not survive through a throne. It survived through ordinary people. People who did not rule countries. People who did not command armies. People who did not write laws or launch wars. People who simply carried a family connection that history would never allow them to completely escape. The empire disappeared. The palace became a museum. The crown was lost. But somewhere in the world, ordinary people still carry the blood of the man who once ruled millions.